They're going to expect a lot more of these tonight. He says Operation Shock and Awe on this ship has begun in earnest.
As well as its vaunted cruise missiles and laser-guided bombs, the Pentagon has revealed another strategic asset in the past 4 days. The combined voices of more than 600 embedded correspondents.
We're having a conflict at a time in our history when we have 24 hours a day television, radio, media, internet. You couple that with the hundreds of people from every aspect of the media who have accepted an opportunity to be connected directly with every aspect of this campaign.
But for now, we are along for the ride with the 2nd Brigade.
Today, we flew in with the RAF to the southern Iraqi port of Qasr. There's been fierce fighting here between US Marines and Iraqi troops. But now the Americans chat casually, right in front of Saddam Hussein.
The CNN camera crew with me now is traveling across the desert, literally embedded with this army, part of the 7th Cavalry.
In the United States, support for the war has increased dramatically since the forward rush began.
Look, television viewers don't like to think. That's not the point of watching television. It's to share the experience. It's to be bathed in the moment. It's not about thinking. And the U.S. knows that, and they exploit it.
But the Pentagon has another audience in mind for this bombardment of sound and image. Rupert Murdoch's Fox News, the most gung-ho supporter of the war on Iraq, is well aware of it.
This is not just for the people back home, but this is for people in a bunker in Baghdad. And if they can see on every network in the sky that the full force of the American and Great Britain's military is headed right to their capital city, they might rethink this thing and surrender.
The BBC knows it too.
I suspect that the American view is that the media can be used, in a sense, as one of their weapons.
It would be a true shame if the press, which has prided itself on its ability to be impartial, suddenly plays this role of psyop operators.
But willingly or unwillingly, reporters have been recruited into a modern war machine that's hoping desperately for an almost bloodless victory.
We're getting these pictures to you. The Pentagon said that CNN could have its own vehicle. Of course, it had to be a diesel-powered vehicle because you can't. There are no gas stations out here. And
on Thursday evening on America's East Coast, viewers who tuned to CNN were greeted by live pictures of the 7th Armored Brigade charging across the Iraqi desert, with commentary from reporter Walter Rogers.
The brilliant engineers at CNN in Atlanta put together a fantastic combination of gee-whiz boxes that we can do what we're doing now, feeding you rolling video phone pictures, not quite the quality of satellite pictures if we're standing still, but nonetheless really quite remarkable stuff.
Greg Kelly is live with the Army's 3rd Infantry Division.
Over at Fox News Channel, reporter Greg Kelly was getting his engineer to explain to his viewers how it was done.
We have a high-speed satellite link that automatically tracks the satellite as we drive across the desert and provides live pictures of everything back to New York, and it's been working pretty good for the last 6-7 hours or so.
Veteran reporters watching at home or from the unembedded sidelines were not always so impressed.
It's very exciting. So are arcade games exciting. And it's wonderful because you feel the fear, but you're safe. And it's a wonderful way to get everybody caught up in the experience of the war, or what seems to be the experience of the war. But if you've seen a lot of dead people, it's a very different experience.
200 extra cameras don't make an ounce of extra insight into something, and we're getting a classic example where so much coverage is actually confusing us rather than enlightening us.
is about. And
but Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld could hardly contain his excitement.
I doubt that in a conflict of this type there's ever been the degree of free press coverage as you are witnessing in this instance.
Of course, there's been a trade-off for the astonishing access. Embedded journalists know far more than they can tell their public.
The generals here, or the senior officers, showed us the map, showed us the battle plan, and so we have a very clear idea of what's unfolding, but of course we cannot discuss the details of that.
This is it, the start of the ground war, the howitzers pounding targets just across the border around.
And there's a growing sense that the embedded press is part of a larger Pentagon strategy, a kind of media shock and awe campaign. Not so prominently featured as the tanks and the ships, specially adapted planes are lumbering through the skies around Iraq. Mobile radio stations broadcasting in Arabic a single message to the Iraqi army.
There are communications in every conceivable mode and method, public and private, to the Iraqi forces, that they can act with honor and turn over their weapons and walk away from them, and they will not be hurt.
America and its allies would dearly love not to have to fight through Baghdad. They're hoping to shock Iraqis into surrender. And they're hoping that the images of irresistible might that have filled our screens are filling Iraqi screens and minds as well.
And if you wanted to scare the hell out of your enemy, there's no doubt by showing pictures of huge tank columns, and they are massive. I mean, you just, you know, that is shock and awe. Having reports coming from different units all up and down the front, I imagine is very scary.
In war, far more than in peace, the journalists are at the mercy of the generals. What they can see, what they can learn, what they can report has always been controlled. But journalists have short memories. The army has a long one.
They write down what happened in the last war, learn the lessons, and make plans for the next one. Constant planning going on. Whereas journalists, war correspondents, are not an institution. It's not a profession in which to grow old in. And they don't learn from their lessons, because by the time the next war comes around, they've forgotten what happened the last time. So the military's always got the edge.
And the riots, the demonstrations are not just here in Jordan. As you heard, there was a demonstration today in the Egyptian capital.
It's now mid-morning in Amman, and
more journalists have been sent to cover this conflict than were assigned at the height of the Vietnam War.
Sick of it. I'll be so glad to go home. I don't know. It's the worst area we've been in since I've been in Vietnam.
You think it's worth it?
Yeah, I don't know. They say we're fighting for something. I don't know.
But the experience of that first television war has profoundly influenced the Pentagon's approach to all subsequent conflicts. Journalists felt they conveyed the truth of Vietnam through the fog of military briefings. But the military felt betrayed.
The biggest example of that is the Tet Offensive. The media was reporting that back immediately as a failure on the part of U.S. forces, when in fact it was the North Vietnamese last gasp, if you will, and the U.S. military prevailed tremendously. But the way it was portrayed was just the opposite, and in the end that began the U.S. public's dissatisfaction with our involvement there.
Many of those officers who were young officers in Vietnam are now senior officers in Iraq, and they remember very well what they imagined was done to them by the press at that time. So it's been a long-standing grudge.
In 1983, the United States invaded Grenada. But this is some of the only combat footage shot. The Defense Department had corralled 400 reporters onto the neighboring Caribbean island of Barbados. A frustrated few tried the crossing in a small boat, but the commanding admiral turned it back with a shot across its bows.
It was a Vietnam syndrome, that they would prefer to conduct the operation without the press not only being a hindrance and having to bring them along, which is the view of a lot of people in the military, but also to preclude these types of judgments being made instantaneously without the military having the ability to put its perspective on it.
Months earlier in the Falklands War, the British had come up with a more sophisticated public relations strategy.
The British Armada continues to move south toward the Falklands with the converted ocean liner Canberra and its 2,000 troops rapidly catching up.
They insisted that journalists had to sail with the task force or not at all.
They excluded all neutral and American war correspondents. The American press decided it might send a couple of ships down there, only to be told by the British Ministry of Defence that if they did, they'd be fired upon. The war correspondents on board the British ships there relied on the ships and the British military establishment for their communications. So with that control, nothing was reported that the military didn't really want reported.
The US Defense Department also did a lot of further thinking about press access.
The Americans had learnt from the British experience. By the time the Gulf War came around, can't come unless you get a Saudi visa. The American military recommended who should get visas and who shouldn't. You can't go anywhere unless we accompany you because, quote, it's too dangerous. That was one way of frightening them off. And when you do go anywhere, it will be in a pool. And for those who are not lucky enough to get a pool slot and have to stay at headquarters in Saudi Arabia, then we will give you a daily briefing.
He is neither a strategist, nor is he schooled in the operational art, nor is he a tactician, nor is he a general, nor is he as a soldier. Other than that, he's a great military man. I want you to know that.
Desert Storm press briefings were delivered by the commanding general, the media-savvy Norman Schwarzkopf, effectively reporting on his own performance. The military also toyed with Falkland-style embedding.
The U.S. Marine Corps, for example, early on embedded reporters with their units prior to the start of the ground campaign, and they lived with the Marines for 6-8 weeks. The Army, on the other hand, was very reluctant to bring reporters in and let them live with their units, and so at the end of the day what you saw was the U.S. Marine Corps getting a tremendous amount of coverage, most of it positive.
The air raid sirens are just now going off here near these U.S. bases in Saudi Arabia.
As cruise missiles slid under cover of a new moon into Baghdad, CNN provided a new ingredient: live infrared images. The Pentagon was not unhappy. CNN's coverage suggested that the majority of Baghdad's citizenry could, like the reporters, watch the show because military targets alone were being pounded by precision missiles.
We're crouched behind a window in here. We're about 3 miles from where the center of action at this point seems to be.
A smart war seemed to be covered by smart reporting. But that was misleading. It later emerged that out of sight of the cameras, up to 100,000 Iraqi soldiers had died, most of them under a rain of conventional bombs.
The first Gulf War was not terribly well chronicled, as a matter of fact, because of that difficulty of gaining access to the front lines. It's probably the least chronicled war of any that we have been involved with, and I think that probably it's going to be a long time before we know everything that did, in fact, happen.
Last night, the air raids were among the heaviest of the war. Targets in and around Baghdad were attacked systematically.
But one gruesome incident took place in full view of credible Western TV reporters like the BBC's Jeremy Bowen.
Public shelter in Al Amiriyah, a residential area in the west of the city, took a direct hit. A large crowd had gathered by the time we were taken there this morning. Everyone I spoke to told the same story. They said that the shelter was used by women, children, and old men. Some bystanders said more than 1,000 of them had gone in the night before. The bomb or missile...
For Bowen, the human tragedy was all too apparent. Any Iraqi attempt to exploit it was secondary.
There were dreadful scenes outside the hospital. None of this was set up for our cameras. As usual, we were accompanied at all times by officials, but this was not a propaganda stunt. It was real grief and real anger.
The slaughter at the Amaria shelter would never be forgotten by either side.
Inside there is the sickly smell of burnt human flesh. And behind me, rescue workers are taking out more charred bodies, many of them tiny bodies, obviously of children.
The Iraqis have turned Amaria into a shrine, which visiting journalists are urged to visit.
Ahmed Dia makes a daily visit to the shelter struck by American bombs in the Gulf War. 424 civilians perished here, including his 18-year-old sister.
America still insists Amaria was a military command center, and that coalition planners didn't know civilians were sheltering there at night. In a recent publication called Apparatus of Lies, the White House declares that Saddam Hussein used deaths of innocent civilians to try to undermine international and domestic support for the American-led coalition. When America went to war against Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, journalists hoped to see a loosening of controls. Many hitched along with Northern Alliance troops. But in the south of Afghanistan, where US forces worked, there was almost no access. What a difference this time around.
We have just this second crossed over the border into Iraq. We'll be landing at our target in about 10 minutes' time. Iraq's anti-aircraft artillery have been blazing this morning. We'll soon see if they fire at us.
We crossed the border with the 1st Marine Division, specifically 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, into southern Iraq a couple of hours ago, early this morning. We were actually supposed to cross last night, but the fighting along that particular breach, that's what they refer to, the breach in the wall that had been set up, this earthen dam, along the Iraqi-Kuwait border was so intense last night that we could not cross. We witnessed what was a massive aerial bombardment supported by ground artillery. This was a real fight that took place. There is another fight that is taking place now in the area where we are. Let me tell you where we are. We're near Basra. That's as specific as I can get.
For the invasion of Iraq, the Pentagon has changed gear and placed some 600 journalists with US ground forces under pre-agreed conditions.
Where are you from?
Among a small number of embedded Australian journalists is the ABC's Jeff Thompson.
How long have you been here for? If we've shot anything or filmed anything which may breach what the Americans refer to as their operational security, then we might sort of show that and discuss it with them. We know that one AFP photographer got booted out of his camp because he went into a headquarters area and photographed a map. That's the sort of thing we're not allowed to do. We're not allowed to take big wide shots of a camp showing where it is, that sort of thing. But so far, nothing we've wanted to say, we've been prevented from saying.
It is good in the sense that we've got lots of reporters all over the place, embedded or embedded with all kinds of units. So we are getting a lot of snapshots of this war. But whether you can put those snapshots together into a coherent mosaic and a full picture, I think is doubtful.
And what we are seeing is not the war in Iraq. What we're seeing are slices of the war in Iraq. We're seeing that particularized perspective that reporter or that commentator or that television camera happens to be able to see at that moment. And it is not what's taking place. What you see is taking place, to be sure, but it is one slice, and it is the totality of that is what this war is about and being made up of.
Which apparently suited the Secretary of Defense just fine. In the spanking new Hollywood-designed briefing center in Qatar, there were no briefings at all for more than 2 days.
Nick, if you're looking for precise information, sadly, this central command where I am is not the place to look for it from. Now, I suspect that the American view is that the media can be used, in a sense, as one of their weapons. Anyone listening to the many different reports that the media are making will be left perhaps in a slightly confused state. Anything, obviously, that comes from here, from Central Command, will be taken as authoritative, and at the moment, nothing of any significance or substance is coming from here.
Well, Nick, in that case, let's go to the eyewitnesses on the ground. Thanks for joining us from Central Command headquarters with no news of anything.
Let me begin by saying that my heart and the prayers of this coalition go out to the families of those who have already made the ultimate sacrifice.
General Tommy Franks finally gave his first briefing on Saturday night, Australian time, 2.5 days after the start of the war.
The initiation of combat operations. We refer to that as D-Day. The introduction of Special Operations Forces. We refer to that as S-Day.
His disgruntled audience didn't feel the gung-ho rhetoric, lightly larded with information, had been worth the wait. But if the Pentagon wanted journalists in Doha to be underemployed, it apparently wanted them out of Baghdad altogether.
For their own safety, all foreign nationals, including journalists and inspectors, should leave Iraq immediately.
The Pentagon is reported to have advised American media outlets directly to withdraw.
Before the war had even begun, long before, while the American military was still in the planning stages, they did their best to make certain that there was going to be no reporting of the war from the Iraqi side.
Well, reporters have been advised to get out of Baghdad for very obvious reasons. It's dangerous. It is very, very dangerous there.
A week ago, the ABC and other Australian networks ordered their crews to pack up and start the long drive to Amman in Jordan.
I'd like to be there, but the intelligence that we got was that any number of things could have happened, that possibly Saddam Hussein would have us under house arrest, possibly when dissent did occur on the streets of Baghdad, that we'd be targeted. There were any number of about 45 horrible ways we could have died, according to those who were gathering intelligence and advising us.
By the time the first airstrikes hit Baghdad, most TV networks were dependent on remote-controlled cameras left on rooftops.
Yes, I can hear you, Tracy.
Well, it's good to hear your voice. How's it going there?
Australian radio and TV clamoured for the voices of the only two Australian journalists left in Baghdad, Ian McPhedran and Paul McGough. Ironically, both newspapermen.
Here comes another missile now, just whooshing straight past the window here.
Describe what that's like, Paul.
Pardon? It comes through with a sort of mushroom-coloured orangey flame behind it. It whooshes and whooshes. The first time one came through, here's another one. Here's another one. Sorry, I can't see on the... Oh, there's the explosion. It's just gone. Something is gone. Huge fireball, great big black plume of smoke rising up now.
What every journalist and every government and every targeter knows is that just one misdirected missile could lose America its war of persuasion.
The big problem of this war, and maybe even part of Saddam's strategy, is to reach a moment where there is a massacre of some sort, an atrocity of some sort, collateral damage of some sort that really inflames public opinion in the Arab world and Europe and probably even in the United States. We stopped bombing, the United States stopped bombing Baghdad in the same way after the Amriya incident.
How will we know this time what effect Allied strikes are having? The BBC is still in Baghdad, and so is Al Jazeera, the Arab news channel based in Qatar.
مع قيادات الكونغرس هناك تأييد للإدارة الأمريكية.
Harrowing interviews with civilian casualties of the bombing are already being broadcast directly to the Arab street.
Al Jazeera is definitely talking to the Arab masses, and I think this is what makes it so popular, so influential. There is definitely no comparison between what Al Jazeera is doing and the message that Al Jazeera is carrying and that of CNN. They show sympathy towards the Iraqi case. That's very obvious, and I think that plays with Arab feelings, who most of the Arabs view this as an invasion rather than a war of liberation in that sense. But that has not really been at the cost of sacrificing Al Jazeera's independence and its balanced and what I would call even objective coverage of the war.
Big difference between Iraq and the Gulf War has been the arrival not only of Al Jazeera Arab television, but other Arab television channels as well. And they're in place now in Iraq with lots and lots of crew and as good and as slick and as efficient as CNN or Fox News. And they're going to be competing to tell the truth. Now, how the American military plans to control the Arab television stations, I don't know.
Networks like Al Jazeera have helped to publicize Saddam's claim to be a champion of the Arab world. He's found plenty of support elsewhere in the Middle East. But how much does he really command in the country he's tyrannized? It's a question that reporters faced with endless declarations of loyalty for the leader would love to have honestly answered.
On this day, they were praying for peace, but also victory in war. What we're doing now is for God and also to win the war against the enemy, said this man.
As they sometimes reminded us, every reporter in Baghdad had a government minder at his shoulder.
To ask them about life under Saddam Hussein's regime, we had to use our government-appointed minder, Salah. Film without him and we'd risk arrest. So the responses to our questions were anything if not predictable.
So in those conditions, how could journalists judge how genuine the views of the Iraqi people actually were?
Well, you can't tell them, and I was wondering, are they deluded? Are they ill-informed? Are they scared to say what they feel? Do you like Saddam Hussein? Yes, he got 100% of the vote.
As the coalition forces drew nearer to Baghdad this weekend, the question became more important than ever. Would Iraqis fight for Saddam? Washington was trying desperately to persuade them not to.
There are communications in every conceivable mode and method, public and private, to the Iraqi forces that they can act with honor and turn over their weapons and walk away from them, and they will not be hurt.
Getting the Iraqi army to abandon Saddam is now the sole object of Operation Persuasion. But for many months, governments in Canberra and London and Washington have been trying to persuade us of the threat that he poses. Have they always been honest with us?
The possession of chemical, biological, or even worse still, nuclear weapons by a terrorist network would be a direct, undeniable and lethal threat to Australia and its people. That is the reason, above all others, why I passionately believe that action must be taken to disarm Iraq.
Chemical and biological weapons get the emphasis now, but nuclear weapons pose a far greater threat.
To protect the nation.
Only months ago, we were being told that Saddam Hussein had renewed his pursuit of the bomb and might be within an ace of success.
Many of us are convinced that Saddam Hussein will acquire nuclear weapons fairly soon. Just how soon, we cannot really gauge. Intelligence is an uncertain business, even in the best of circumstances.
Today we published...
Just 2 weeks later, the British government published a 50-page dossier on Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, which made headlines around the world. One of its freshest and most startling claims that Iraq had recently tried to buy uranium ore in Africa. It also detailed Iraq's purchase of tens of thousands of high-grade aluminium tubes, which it said could be used to manufacture centrifuges for enriching uranium ore. Those two elements, the tubes and the Africa purchase, became the mainstays of the American government's claim that Iraq has a current nuclear weapons program.
The British government has learned that Saddam Hussein recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa. Our intelligence sources tell us that he has attempted to purchase high-strength aluminum tubes suitable for nuclear weapons production. Saddam Hussein has not credibly explained these activities. He clearly has much to hide.
But as Colin Powell grudgingly admitted to the Security Council, many experts doubted that the tubes had anything to do with nuclear weapons.
There is controversy about what these tubes are for. Most U.S. experts think they are intended to serve as rotors in centrifuges used to enrich uranium. Other experts and the Iraqis themselves argue that they are really to produce the rocket bodies for a conventional weapon, a multiple rocket launcher.
David Albright is one of America's foremost experts on nuclear weapons manufacture. He's a former nuclear inspector in Iraq.
Most centrifuge experts in this country and abroad do not believe that they were specifically intended for use in centrifuges, and instead think they're more suitable for use in a rocket, as the Iraqis declared. But the way decisions are made in the intelligence community is each agency gets a vote. And so, you had the Defense Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, all voting. And so they outvoted the Department of Energy in particular. But those people at these other intelligence agencies don't have a clue about nuclear issues.
On March the 7th, Mohammed El-Baradei, the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, reported quite definitively to the Security Council.
Extensive field investigation and document analysis have failed to uncover any evidence that Iraq intended to use these 81mm tubes for any project other than the reverse engineering of rockets.
The claim that Iraq had tried to buy uranium ore from the African country of Niger was groundless too, said El-Baradei in the same briefing. It had been based on forged documents.
Based on thorough analysis, the IA has concluded, with the concurrence of outside experts, that these documents, which form the basis for the reports of recent uranium transactions between Iraq and Niger, are in fact not authentic. We have therefore concluded that these specific allegations are unfounded.
I think the Bush administration is not using even what we'd call standard practices to assess intelligence information. It's politicized the whole process, and it's seeking evidence that supports its claim and dismissing evidence that contradicts their political goals and claims, and they're willing to punish people who dissent. So I think in my mind, it's scandalous.
By March the 7th, the world's media were obsessed with the last-minute maneuvering over a Security Council resolution. The Atomic Energy Agency's conclusion that Iraq has no current nuclear weapons program got almost no publicity at all. But America is still trying to persuade the world that there are proven links between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda. It was a subject on which Colin Powell spent much time on February the 5th and had new things to say. He showed slides of what he claimed was a poison and explosives training camp in the Kurdish-controlled area of northeast Iraq. It was part, he said, of a terrorist network run by al-Qaeda associate Abu Musab al-Zarqawi.
Those helping to run this camp are Zarqawi lieutenants operating in northern Kurdish areas outside Saddam Hussein's controlled Iraq. But Baghdad has an agent in the most senior levels of the radical organization Ansar al-Islam that controls this corner of Iraq. In 2000, this agent offered al-Qaeda safe haven in the region. After we swept al-Qaeda from Afghanistan, some of its members accepted this safe haven. They remain there today.
This part of Colin Powell's lecture infuriated an Australian intelligence analyst watching in Canberra. It was one of the major reasons that Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Wilkie resigned from the Office of National Assessments and joined the peace protesters outside Parliament House.
I got quite angry, I recall, when I saw the telecast. It just didn't make sense to me that if there is this link why is the poisons factory located in an area that is clearly outside of Saddam's control? I mean, it may as well not be in Iraq. So I don't know that this so-called agent that was referred to changes the bottom line here, and that is that there's no hard evidence of any active cooperation between Iraq and al-Qaeda, and I don't believe that Colin Powell's presentation established any link. All it established is that in somewhere outside of Saddam's control, there is an al-Qaeda presence.
When British journalists visited the so-called poison camp, just 4 days after Colin Powell's presentation, they found nothing but a dilapidated collection of concrete outbuildings at the foot of a grassy, sloping hill. Tragically, Ansar al-Islam is now back in the news. On Friday night, local time, its base was attacked by American aircraft and cruise missiles and then overwhelmed by Kurdish militia. Next day, a suicide bomber killed ABC cameraman Paul Moran as he was filming outside the base.
We understand from Kurdish sources that the attack on the journalist was by an organisation called Ansar al-Islam, which is an al-Qaeda-related terrorist organisation which has been operating in the Kurdish area of northern Iraq for some time.
But no government minister since the attack has claimed that the incident proves anything about a link between al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein.
There's evidence of links between a branch of al-Qaeda and Iraqi intelligence, but Kerry, the argument I put is a broader one than that.
In fact, the Prime Minister says his argument no longer relies on any existing link between Iraq and al-Qaeda.
It is a matter of elementary logic that if you have a growing number of rogue states with chemical and biological weapons, the possibility of those weapons, either by gift or misadventure or theft, coming into the hands of a terrorist organisation must increase.
Whether or not the public is persuaded, Australia is now at war. The Prime Minister is urging all Australians, whatever their views, to support the men and women of the ADF. Yet at first, the government didn't make it easy for the public to know what their armed forces were actually doing in the Middle East.
Simon, what can you tell us?
Jim, well, the Australian Defence spokesmen here are playing everything very, very close to their chest. While the US and British military appear to be more open with their media, it's not the case with ours.
Well, Simon, any more details about the involvement of Australia's FA-18 jets?
Jim, only that they are involved, ongoing involvement. We're not being told much at all about them. We're not even being told if they've actually fired their weapons in their missions over Iraq.
I've got to say that even in the Vietnam years, the Australian military was the worst in trying to stop their troops being exposed to coverage, and today they're even worse.
The information that you're receiving.
Late last year, in the run-up to the war, Defence Force spokesman Brigadier Mike Hannon went to media organisations with a deal that could have seen them virtually surrender control over what they reported. This draft document was prepared with the assistance of law firm Clayton Utz. Before any journalist could be accredited, the Defence Minister had to be advised. Journalists would be required not to disclose information other than in accordance with operational security briefings and the operational security guidance provided by the Commonwealth. They would also abide by all Force Public Information Centre rules which will be given from time to time. The proposed deal appears to have been quietly dropped in the face of media resistance. Peter LaFranchi is shocked it was even suggested.
But the clauses in that document, for example, would prevent an Australian journalist revealing something, say, like the My Lai massacre in Vietnam. It prohibits you are not allowed to identify operations people. Anything that Defence says is what you must report. That's not freedom of the press at all. That is a dictatorship of the media.
Mike Hannon claims the document was not designed for the Iraq operation.
The document has no relevance to the current operations, and that our policy is quite clearly that we don't censor journalists. We do ask for their cooperation, however, in protecting operational security, and I think everyone would understand that.
the US military have given some more information about what kind of ordnance was used, what targets were hit. Why can't you at least say as much or go as far as the US and the British military seem to be going in terms of putting out information?
Yeah. Well, as I said, the information that you're receiving depends upon where it's coming from and who's releasing it. With all of our Australian forces, they are specialised, highly specialised groups working in fairly close niches. Now, we don't have the capacity to release information about a lot of those, and that's just a simple fact of life.
That there needed to be a blackout on the SAS was understood. But the media complained that even the location of Australia's FA-18 aircraft was being concealed.
Again, that contrasts with both UK and US practice. The Americans are perfectly happy to identify their frontline fighter aircraft sitting in Qatar. Australia says that we should not identify the fact that Australia's F-18s are sitting in Qatar. It's a considerable difference. It's one that has a particular issue of transparency attached to it.
But suddenly on Friday, the Australian Defence Force had a change of heart. A press conference was convened in Qatar for Australian journalists only. The Americans wouldn't allow their coalition ally to use the briefing centre, so they gathered in the car park.
There have been a number of contacts since they've gone in there. They have in some cases killed Iraqi military, although in one case where they had a contact going in, they wounded a number. The rest either dropped their weapons or ran away. They stopped. Their medics treated the wounded Iraqis. We moved on.
When the briefing was over, information-starved British and American reporters encircled the Aussie press to ask what they'd heard. Meanwhile, images from the embedded correspondents kept rolling in.
This was hard, relentless driving, taking the column 120 miles deep inside Iraq.
Never has a mechanized force moved so fast and so far.
But not all portrayed invincible forward motion.
7th Cavalry was moving forward through a city which we can't identify at this point. They took some fire from Iraqi units, actually a small group of soldiers. The 7th Cavalry had to call in artillery. I hope you can see in the distance the huge plumes of smoke going up behind us. They've turned us around.
The resistance may not have been especially effective, but despite all the efforts of Operation Persuasion, by Sunday night, only one under-strength army division had surrendered. Viewers had seen only small groups of captured troops. We've been told that the Iraqis, especially in the south, would welcome liberation from their tyrannous oppressor.
There's no indication of that. The Iraqis, or at least some of the Iraqis, seem to be defending their country against an invasion.
General Tommy Franks insists that we're not seeing the full picture.
We have with certain knowledge the fact that thousands more have laid down their weapons and have gone home.
There have been other images the coalition would rather not have screened. From the BBC in Baghdad, for example.
This may be something the Iraqis want us to witness, but this does not make such scenes any less distressing.
Al Jazeera has been airing images of the dead as well as the civilian wounded. Even if so far the numbers of casualties seem to be small, such images inevitably fuel the worldwide protests. There's a lot still lying ahead across the desert. If resistance collapses in the next few days, Operation Persuasion will have been a triumph, and reporters may find themselves embedded for many a conflict to come. If it turns out that Iraqis are determined to fight, Operation Persuasion will have failed, in Iraq and the wider world. Its authors will be judged to have miscalculated badly, and to have persuaded only themselves.